177 DC. He was 56 years old and he was going back to the front. Not because the war had gotten worse, it hadn't, particularly. The Germanic coalition was fractured, the frontier was more stable than it had been in a decade, and the diplomatic groundwork Marcus had been laying for years was beginning to produce results. The war was winnable. He could see the shape of the settlement that would end it. He was going back because the settlement required his presence. And because Rome, without him in it, was becoming something he didn't want to watch. Commodus was 17. He had been co-emperor for a year. He had spent that year in Rome doing what 17-year-old co-emperors with no philosophical training and unlimited resources tended to do, which was not governing. The Senate watched. The court watched. The advisors Marcus had appointed watched. Everyone watched and no one said the thing that needed to be said, which was that the heir to the most philosophical reign in Roman history was showing no interest in philosophy, governance, or anything that could not be fought, raced, or celebrated in an arena. Marcus went north. He took Commodus with him. Because the front was the best teacher he knew. Because there was no better education in what an empire actually was than watching it maintained at its most difficult point. Because his own education had happened by proximity, by watching Antoninus Pius do the work, day after day, until the work became comprehensible. He was going to give his son the same education. He had 3 years left to do it. He went back to the front at 56 years old, taking his son with him to teach him what governing actually meant. He was preparing a settlement that would have secured the northern frontier for a generation. He died before he could finish it. What Commodus did next undid everything. This is the final episode. Subscribe, like the video, and let's finish this together. The campaign of 178 was different from the earlier phases of the Germanic War. Marcus had spent 9 years learning the specific military and diplomatic geography of the Danube frontier. He knew which tribes could be peeled away from the Marcomannic coalition through negotiation. He knew which commanders were most effective in which terrain. He knew where the frontier needed to be pushed to become genuinely defensible rather than merely held. He had a plan. The plan was territorial expansion, pushing the Roman frontier north of the Danube into Marcomannic and Sarmatian territory, establishing 2 new provinces that would shorten the frontier line and give Rome a buffer zone of client territory between the river and the Germanic heartland. It was the most ambitious Roman territorial expansion since Trajan, and it was based not on the desire for glory but on the cold strategic logic of a man who had spent a decade studying the problem. He discussed it with Commodus during the campaign. The sources record these conversations at a distance. They were private, between father and son, in the military tent that they shared at the front. What survives is the impression that Marcus was trying to transmit not just the plan but the reasoning behind it. Not just what to do but how to think about what to do. Commodus listened. Whether he understood is a question the historical record leaves open. The relationship between Marcus Aurelius and Commodus is one of the most painful things in Roman history precisely because of how clearly Marcus saw it. He was not blind to his son's limitations. The Meditations, which never mention Commodus by name, maintaining the private discretion that characterized the journal throughout, contain passages about the obligation to love people as they are rather than as you wish they were. About the instruction not to be surprised when others fail to share your values. About the necessity of continuing to act well regardless of whether the people around you do the same. He was writing about Commodus. He was also continuing to prepare him for the throne, because the alternative was worse. An emperor who disinherited his son in favor of an adopted heir was an emperor who had declared, publicly, that his biological children were inadequate, which was a statement about the emperor's own legacy as much as the child's fitness. And a contested succession, in the aftermath of the Cassius rebellion, was a risk Marcus had already assessed and decided was unacceptable. He kept teaching. He took Commodus to the front. He included him in military councils. He introduced him to the generals and the frontier commanders whose knowledge of the Danube situation had been accumulated over decades. He was giving his son every tool he could think of. He could not give him the character to use them. The last books of the Meditations show a different Marcus than the earlier ones. Not broken, the philosophical framework held. The instructions to himself continued to the end, the same discipline applied to the same fundamental questions about how to live. But there is, in the later books, a quality of exhaustion that is different from the ordinary tiredness of campaign life. The exhaustion of a man who has been doing a hard thing for a very long time and can see the end of his capacity to continue. He wrote about death more in the later books. Not with fear. The Stoics had never feared death, and Marcus had been working through the philosophical arguments about mortality since he was a young man reading Epictetus on his palace floor. He wrote about it with the specific attention of a man for whom it had stopped being an abstract philosophical topic and become a practical near-term reality. He wrote, "It is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live." He had begun to live at 17, when Hadrian chose him and the choice removed every comfortable alternative. He had lived, fully, difficultly, with the complete attention to the present moment that the Stoics demanded, for 40 years after that. He was tired. He kept writing anyway. 180 DC. The campaign was going well. The Marcomanni were negotiating. The Sarmatian situation had stabilized. The framework of the new provincial arrangement was taking shape in the diplomatic correspondence that Marcus managed personally, the specific terms of the settlements with individual tribes, the boundaries of the new provinces, the garrison arrangements that would make the frontier sustainable. He was close. In March of 180 at the Roman military base of Vindobona, the site of what is now Vienna, Marcus Aurelius fell ill. The sources disagree on the specifics. The Historia Augusta says he refused food for 6 days before his death, accelerating the end deliberately. Cassio Dion says he was already dying of disease and the fasting was a response to medical advice. Tertullian, writing later, implies other causes. What the sources agree on is what happened in the days before he died. He continued working. He heard cases. He signed documents. He met with military commanders and diplomatic envoys. He did the work that needed to be done for as long as he was capable of doing it. On the last day he was able to receive visitors, he summoned his senior commanders and gave them their instructions for the continuation of the campaign. He told them to go to Commodus. He told them Commodus was emperor now. Then he asked them to leave. He died during the night of March 17, 180 AD. He was 58 years old. Commodus abandoned the campaign within months. The settlements Marcus had been negotiating, the new provinces, the extended frontier, the strategic arrangement that would have secured the northern border for a generation, were cancelled. Commodus made peace with the Germanic tribes on terms that gave Rome nothing it hadn't already had before the wars began. He collected a triumph. He went back to Rome. He never returned to the frontier. In Rome, Commodus became what the sources describe with increasing alarm. An emperor who identified himself with Hercules, who participated personally in gladiatorial combat, who renamed Rome after himself, who executed senators and officials with the casual frequency of a man who had never developed the philosophical framework that might have given him pause. The reign lasted 12 years. He was assassinated in 192, strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, in a conspiracy organized by his own household. Everything Marcus had built, the administrative competence, the philosophical approach to governance, the painstaking diplomatic work on the northern frontier, required a competent successor to survive. It did not get one. The historians who wrote about Commodus used a specific image: the golden age of the Antonines ending, the silver giving way to iron and rust. The 5 good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, Marcus, followed by a 6th who was not good, who had been given every advantage that birth and parental love and the greatest philosophical mind of the ancient world could provide, and who had used none of it. Marcus had seen it coming. He had done it anyway. The Meditations were not published in Marcus's lifetime. They were private notes, written for himself, never intended for an audience, the working documents of a mind that used writing the way other minds use silence. They survived because someone, possibly Commodus, possibly a court official, possibly a philosopher who understood what they were, preserved them after Marcus's death. They were first published in a printed edition in 1558, 1400 years after they were written. They have not been out of print since. Every generation since has found in them something useful. Soldiers and politicians and philosophers and ordinary people trying to understand how to live with what cannot be changed. The Stoic framework that Marcus built his life around has proven more durable than the empire he governed, more permanent than the frontier he died trying to secure, more lasting than anything a military campaign could have won. He wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." He wrote it in a military tent. He wrote it while governing an empire he hadn't wanted, fighting a war he hadn't started, preparing a successor he knew was inadequate, dying of a disease he couldn't cure. He meant every word. And 2,000 years later, in languages he never heard, in countries that didn't exist when he was alive, people are still reading what he wrote and finding in it the same thing he found when he first read Epictetus on a palace floor at 11 years old. A way through.